All right, welcome everyone. It's 9:35, so why don't we get started? So welcome all to today's session on carbon pricing, federalism, and the future of Canadian climate policy. My name is Runa Das, and I'm an associate professor in interdisciplinary studies at Royal Roads University in Victoria, BC. Today's event is being presented as part of the York University Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change Sustainable Energy Initiatives ongoing seminar series on current issues around energy and climate change policy. I would like to remind everyone that the session is being recorded and will be posted on the EUC and SEI websites. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Royal Roads University, where I am based, is on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. With gratitude, we live, work, and learn here where the past, present, and future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff come together. I invite all of you today to reflect on your own locations and the histories of colonization and occupation and treaty holders and Indigenous communities on those lands. Today's speakers include Angela Carter, Canada Research Chair in Equitable Energy Governance and Public Policy, Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador in St. John's; Pierre-Olivier Pinault, Research Chair in Energy Sector Management at HEC in Montreal; Mark Winfield, Professor and SEI Co-Chair, Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, York University, Toronto; Keith Brownsey, Professor, Economics, Justice and Policy Studies, Mount Royal University, Calgary; George Hoberg, Professor, School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, UBC, Vancouver. And I also want to note York University MES JD student JJ Strands, who is also helping with logistics and will be monitoring the chat. I would like to take this time to acknowledge the absence of Indigenous representation on the panel. This is not an oversight, but more of a function of our struggles with how to give effective representation to those communities in this format, particularly given the focus on federal provincial political dynamics and the expertise of our speakers. We are very conscious of the need to address the roles of Indigenous peoples around climate change, but uncertain of the appropriate platform and format for doing so. So quickly, I'd like to go over the format and procedure. Each speaker will have up to 10 minutes for their opening statement. I would like to ask the audience if you could hold your questions until everyone has completed their opening statement. We will be recognizing questions via the raise hand function in Zoom, and so not chat. JJ will be watching the chat for any really consistent questions / themes that emerge, but people wishing to ask questions, please use the raise hand function. I would like to ask that questions and answers be as short and concise as possible, as our time is limited this morning. Questions can be directed to an individual speaker or the panel as a whole. Also, I'd like to ask that you keep yourselves on mute if you're not speaking or unless you're asking a question, but please feel free to leave your cameras on. So with that, why don't we begin? We are going to go from east to west. So with that, I will turn it over to Angela Carter.
Hey, hello everybody. Pleasure to be here with you all. How are those slides looking? Can I see, Runa? Thumbs up, everything's good. Okay, thank you, Pierre-Olivier. All right, so I'm delighted to be with you today. I was asked to speak to some of the climate policy issues in Newfoundland and Labrador, and drawing from my expertise, which is more so focused on oil development and the link to climate crisis. I'm going to be speaking from that perspective with you for the next 10 minutes, and then hopefully we can chat a bit more in the Q&A as well. But first, to start, I'd like to say that I'm a white settler researcher, and I respectfully acknowledge that I'm from Uktungbuk, which is the island of Newfoundland. And Newfoundland and Labrador is, of course, the ancestral homeland of multiple Indigenous peoples. And here at Memorial University, we are working actively on decolonialization as well as anti-colonialization policies and practices. So But in particular, in dealing with this issue of climate crisis and energy policy and politics, what I am endeavoring to do in my own work is to center on how it is that we move forward with anti-colonial climate policy. I would argue that equitable climate action and energy transition, it requires more than acknowledging the land, but instead is a commitment to actively doing new kinds of climate policy. And this is going to be a real challenge in the Newfoundland and Labrador context. So with that, I would like to just give a couple of pieces of context here for those who aren't familiar what's happening in Newfoundland and Labrador with regards to climate commitments. So we do have a commitment in the province to reduce by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030, as well as a net zero by 2050 commitment. There is a new climate change mitigation action plan that's currently under development. In fact, consultations are underway right now between the province and various key actors across society. But just to say in short form, we in Newfoundland and Labrador, of course, we have targets that are not being met, as you can see here, pretty stable emissions over time, but not decreasing, certainly not to the way that we need to see given the climate crisis imperatives. And what I would note is just here, this little asterisk excludes beta nord. So I think this is really interesting that when we're talking about climate policy in this province, there's always a reference, of course, to oil and gas production. And I'm going to zone in on that now in a moment. So here are the again, just a small piece of context, the GHG sources in the province, a great deal from transportation, which of course is SUVs for the most part, and light duty trucks, 47% of emissions. Oil and gas extraction, that is 25% of total emissions. So I just want to focus on that 25% actually from here on in for the rest of my comments. And this is vitally important in terms of climate policy in the Newfoundland and Labrador context for a couple of obvious and maybe not so obvious reasons. The offshore projects, offshore oil extraction projects, they feature among the largest final emitters in Canada. These are big emissions, big emitters. The upstream emissions, so those coming from extraction and fugitive emissions, are about 1.5 million tons per year attributed to offshore oil. Since the lifetime of extraction, so oil has been extracted off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador since 1997, it's about 39 million tons all told. But of course, if we take I would say, more accurate look at the climate cost of the oil and gas sector, that means considering the downstream emissions, so the end use emissions associated with this sector. And so using EPA emission factors, if we consider all the oil that has been produced off the shore since 1997, we're talking about 989 million tons of CO2 equivalent. So this is a huge contribution to the climate crisis. And then when you think about and listen to what oil proponents are arguing, an aspirational extraction into the future, some are arguing that, there could be as many as 5 billion barrels of oil to be extracted off the coast. And of course, imagining what that full potential looks like in terms of a climate cost is huge indeed. So just to put this more sort of a visual picture here, we've got our extractive emissions, and then we've got the consumption side emissions from that oil, which are indeed truly significant. All right. So if we see that there is an urgent need to start to rethink Newfoundland and Labrador's dependence on oil production from a climate perspective, but there's something else going on here as well. And so I would argue there's an urgent need to manage that production phase out as a piece of climate policy, but also economic policy. First off, we know that this needs to happen given the climate crisis, which of course Newfoundland and Labrador is highly exposed to. And at the same time, we know that this is already happening. This phase out is already starting to happen with major economic and employment impacts on the province. And the flip side, of course, is the significant opportunities in transitioning. So those are two pieces that I try to hold together when I'm thinking about this work. I won't belabor this point, but we know that governments like Canada and Newfoundland and Labrador specifically are planning on producing way more than what would keep us within a 1.5-degree aligned future. This fossil fuel production budget is something that governments like Canada are definitely blowing past that budget. And this really is a problem that is continuing in Newfoundland and Labrador as well. In fact, this was government policy from 2018, the hoped for continued expansion of oil production off the coast. So you can see that this need to bend the curve on production, to bend the curve on emissions, and therefore global warming is not something that's featuring prominently in provincial policy. But the risk here is also on the economic side. And we're hearing this now from very high levels, indicating, for example, the International Energy Agency indicating recently that global demand for oil and gas is going to peak. And this is going to be an irreversible peak and then decline before 2030. So we know we've got about 6 years by conservative estimates of global oil demand before it peaks. And we know that all exporters are going to be affected. Why is that? Well, why is this happening? Why is global oil demand now suddenly in question? Well, for the energy transition that is unfolding in our midst. So efficiency gains by low carbon energy, the ramp up of low emissions electricity and transportation. So basically, even on a market basis, we are now seeing that low carbon energy systems are more competitive than fossil fuel powered ones. And so this, of course, is putting pressure on producers like Newfoundland and Labrador. So we know that high cost producers are going to get squeezed out first. Canada's not going to be selling the last barrel of oil. We can't be shielded from this. And this is particularly pressing in the case of Newfoundland and Labrador, where we have very high cost oil given, it's deep, ultra far offshore. If we look at what the Canada Energy Regulator is anticipating, well, we do see that declining oil production to 2050. But what I would say is that this graph, these scenarios, a set of scenarios that were recently produced, these assumed that the big Bay du Nord project was going to go ahead, starting to produce in the late 2020s. So this assumes Bay du Nord proceeding, but Equinor shelved that project in June of last year, not for environmental reasons or climate reasons, but due to cost increases and market volatility. So apparently there's another announcement coming from Equinor this July, so we'll see if there's been a shift in that perspective. What we do know, though, is that there is a question now around the future of the offshore in Newfoundland and Labrador. So what does this mean? So in terms of climate crisis, we know we've got to start that decline and that phase out. It looks like there's some indications that firms are already starting to do that pullback. Now then, as we move forward with climate policy, what we need is climate policy that manages equitably a phase out of oil production. And I think in broad strokes, what's needed here is both the parachutes and the ladders. So supports to help fossil fuel workers out of the industry and then ladders into a new clean economy. So a soft landing out of fossil fuels and then a ladder to help them climb into the benefits of a clean economy. So that's pretty clear. And it's also something that we're starting to see finally as part of both climate policy and economic diversification policy that's coming out of conversations with both the Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labor, as well as with the provincial NDP. But for the two dominant parties, this notion of equitable transition or ambitious climate policy that sees Newfoundland and Labrador really starting to bend the curve of its emissions in the way that we need to see happen globally, it's not really part of the conversation yet in the way that we need it to be. So that is what I will say to start, and I will stop there and look forward to some questions and discussions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. And so next, let's keep moving. Pierre-Olivier.
Good. Thank you, Runa. Thanks everyone for being there. I'll be saying a few things about Quebec's climate policy, which is stable, ambitious, and underperforming. So I'll be describing the Quebec's climate policy, mostly centering it on the carbon price in Quebec, which is at the center of Quebec's climate policy. There's been a tax on carbon since 2007, so we probably have a long history of carbon pricing in Quebec. So that's something some people are proud of here, although with a very, very tiny, at a very, very tiny level. So it's mostly insignificant. As you can see, from 2007 to 2014, $3.5 per ton, making it less than a cent per liter of gasoline. But still, it was still generating some money going to the green fund, and that was helping funding some projects, some climate policy projects, if energy efficiency, different types of projects that have resulted in some greenhouse gas emission reductions over time. And that carbon fee from 2007 is due to Jean Charest. So that's something I just want to remind everyone, because he in Quebec, he's basically the one who got us into carbon tax and then cap and trade. It's because of Jean Charest that Quebec entered into the cap and trade system with California. So the cap and trade from 2013, it started with the industry for 2 years, and then in 2015. Almost all sectors were covered by the cap and trade system. And it's been a joint cap and trade system with California since 2014. And as you can see, the price has risen from the $10 a ton in 2013 to the last auctions. It was standing at $56 per ton. So some increase, of course. Now it's well below the federal carbon price, which is at $85 per ton. But the advantage of the Quebec system is that it covers all sectors except agriculture, waste, air, and marine transportation. So in that sense, it is a simpler system because it has, everyone is treated the same. Which is in a way good, although there are some free allowances to the industry. I won't get into the details because we don't have so much time. But that's really at the center of the Quebec policy, climate policy. And something that has to be mentioned and is remarkable in Quebec is that there is unanimity around this cap and trade system. There is not a single party in Quebec that says that we should actually remove that cap and trade system, get out of it. The current Coalition pour l'avenir du Québec, the CAQ, is the governing party now. They kept it. They're maintaining the cap and trade. The Liberals, the Parti québécois, Québec solidaire, they all say that that's a system that is that should be kept, which in a way is very interesting because it has a hard cap on emissions, and that hard cap is declining over time, and that's the only way you can that creates a real constraint, an absolute constraint on emissions. So Quebec has that, and for that reason, I think it's a very good system. It has generated a lot of dollars over the years. Just last year, $1.4 billion that are not sent back directly to citizens or company, but are funding some programs that are expected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So as you can see, since 2013, $8.8 billion have been generated. Now, because politicians like to put new names on things, it's not anymore the Green Fund, it's the Electrification and Climate Change Fund, which basically funds energy efficiency programs, EVs, EV subsidies for users. There's a lot of money also going for public transit, especially for the electrification of public transit. So that's the carbon price in Quebec, how it has, and it's really at the center of the policy. Although if you look at what the government is presenting at its climate change policy, you would see hundreds of actions that are minimal. Minimal in the sense that they don't produce lots of results. So if we look at our ambitions in Quebec, and then you can see the different years with different ambitions. We actually met the 2012 target, which was 6% below 1990 levels. We can say we mostly met that target because Shell closed its refinery in 2010, and that basically removed 1% of our emissions in the province. So thanks for the refinery closure, we could meet that target. Of course, consumption levels of fossil fuels did not decline in Quebec. So it's just that it hasn't been refined in Quebec anymore, but refined somewhere else. So overall, there's no global gain. But for our target, it's good. In 2020, thanks to COVID, we were at -12% below 1990 level. And the government claimed that we actually met the target. The -20% target is met, realized the target. That's because Quebec emitters could purchase some emission rights in California. So officially, Quebec exceeded the target. We were not at -12%, but if you look at the type of accounting the government is using, then basically we are at -12, not -12, but -26% below 1990 level. And so that allows us to say that we actually met also the 2020 target. For 2030, we don't know where we will be, but since we were in 2022 at -6.3%, I don't see how we can be at -37% in 6 years. But still, the target is still there, and in 2050 we will be there. We're aiming at net zero. So Quebec often looks good in terms of climate policy because we have the lowest emissions per capita. So you can see Quebec is on top of all other provinces, only 9.1 ton per capita in 2022. So that may look good, but when we look actually at how these emissions per capita changed between 1990 and 2022, then we're not doing so well. So emissions per capita only decreased by 24% in Quebec during these 32 years, much less than what happened in Ontario, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick. So in terms of effectiveness, we haven't been reducing at the same rate as some other provinces did. And maybe maybe it's not so much due to our policies, but just simply to the fact that the economy is changing. And I have, another graph that I want to show you is that maybe we only declined because we were in the east. Because if you look at all the eastern provinces, Ontario and east, then overall there's a decline of 12%. And west of Ontario, all provinces increased their emission from 1990 to 2022. So you can see that, and among the eastern provinces, we are actually the province that decreased the least its emissions by, and you can see that at the bottom of the chart, we decreased by only 6% our emissions, which is the lowest score among all eastern provinces. So that's why I said, although we have an ambitious and stable climate policy, we are underperforming because we're not reducing at a rate that we should be reducing. And even other provinces that may not be so proud of announcing they have strong climate policies, they are doing better than Quebec. And that's why I'm claiming we are underperforming. So in terms of perspective, where are we heading? Quebec still has the only cap and trade system in Canada. Ontario had one for one or 2 years, and Nova Scotia had one and may have one again. But still, so we do have a cap and trade system. It's there is a cap that is currently ineffective at reducing emissions and constraining us. But and then I've written a paper that I'm advertising here. Our current cap is non-constraining and will not be constraining before 2030. But beyond 2030, there might actually be a chance that it will hit emitters. and therefore start to be a real constraint on our emissions. Something that is good about Quebec is that we're linked with California, and California is more serious about its greenhouse gas targets, and Quebec may follow its partner in being more serious about how we handle the climate crisis and our emission reduction policies. And also, what I think is important in the Quebec policy is that the fact that New York, which is a big Quebec partner, is putting in place a cap and invest program, which with stricter rules than the Quebec and California rules. They just changed the name for cap and invest because it was more sexy than cap and trade. But basically it is a cap and trade system. And again, Quebec may follow its neighbor, and that will limit the capacity of Quebec of not basically meeting its target or keeping in place its cap and trade system. Thank you. I'll stop here and I'll look forward to more questions after everyone has talked.
Thanks very much. Merci beaucoup, Pierre-Olivier. And over to you now, Mark.
Thanks, Runa. Speaking to you from Takaranto, and I want to acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and also note that this location is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I'm going to focus my comments on the Ontario federal relationship around climate change, because this is a complicated story, and it has sort of different phases, and where we are is kind of an interesting question. We began for a fairly extended period, a relatively strong federal provincial partnership. Ontario had been one of the subnational climate policy leaders during the Harper period. And then Premier Wynn's sort of role was very instrumental, along with the premiers of Quebec and Alberta and BC, in the formulation of the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. So it was fairly central to the federal provincial consensus, which then led to the establishment of the backstop carbon price. But of course, part of the assumption there was at the time that the federal role in carbon pricing was going to be entirely residual, given that most provinces, certainly the largest provinces, had or were in the process of implementing carbon pricing systems of their own. Now, as we know, this story has gone in very different directions. And in the case of Ontario and Ottawa, from one of partnership to fairly direct hostility and electoral competition, Mr. Ford, when he became premier in 2018, in some ways that's sort of something of a watershed in the unraveling of the federal provincial consensus which existed around the Pan-Canadian Framework. Mr. Ford moved almost immediately to dismantle the Climate Change Action Plan, which had been adopted by the Wynne government, very clearly a focus on carbon pricing as a central focus. But from the federal government's perspective, that was not necessarily a terrible thing, in a sense that in 2019 and 2021, Mr. Trudeau effectively ran against Mr. Ford with climate as a fairly central focus in the campaign. We've now kind of moved into sort of post-COVID and post the 2022 re-election of the Ford government in Ontario into a different kind of phase, and I'm sort of portraying this as something of an unrequited romance, in the sense that Ottawa very much wants to be Doug's friend, but it's not at all clear that those feelings are entirely reciprocated, particularly around climate change. There is sort of a dynamic that pretty much anything that the Ford government wants from Ottawa, it gets. $1 billion and streamlined federal approvals for economically and technologically doubtful nuclear projects, we now seem to be passing 40 billion around electric vehicle and battery manufacturing in a province where, in fact, the Ford government completely dismantled the strategy that existed around electrification of transportation. And indeed, highway expansion is a fairly central theme for the provincial government. And they most recently, we saw what in the eyes of many people was something a fairly shocking federal back down on the question of the 413 highway, which is a very central sort of element of Mr. Ford's Get It Done agenda, which would run across the south slope of the Oak Ridges Moraine. And at one point, it had been designated as a designated project, actually be a ministerial designation under the Impact Assessment Act. And then a few weeks ago, that designation was undone and accompanied by a fairly complete federal surrender on all of the other regulatory approvals, Fisheries Act, species at risk, that would have been required for that project through what is a very, very ecologically sensitive area. The challenge for Mr. Trudeau is that there seems to be nothing in return for these offers of friendship. This is a very one-sided relationship. That the Ford government's sort of war on carbon pricing, especially the consumer carbon price, which as a result of the unraveling of the Pan-Canadian framework, the federal government has ended up being the primary implementer of, except in Quebec and British Columbia. And of course, therefore carrying all the political cost that goes with that as well. So there's certainly no peace from the Ford government on the carbon pricing front. In terms of substantive climate policy, there is no plan and there is no strategy. The strategy that existed in 2017 was completely dismantled. There was briefly a notional strategy in 2018, but the Auditor General and others have noted that there was absolutely nothing done to implement that plan. And indeed, we're now seeing in Ontario a reversal of the downward trajectory that we saw over the preceding decade. And you saw that some of that in Pierre Olivier's slides as well, that a combination of the process of deindustrialization and then also the phase out of coal-fired electricity between 2002 and 2013 had produced quite a substantial reduction in emissions. That is now being reversed. We're seeing in particular a dramatic growth in greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector. We're basically on track to an increase by a factor of between 6 and 8 times relative to the low in 2017. This is largely a product of the ramp up of gas-fired generation, but also the addition of new gas-fired generation, mostly to cover retiring or refurbished nuclear plants. And then in areas like even on space heating, there's certainly no strategy to decarbonize. This is crucial because, of course, this is buildings and transportation, along with the electricity sector, are where you're seeing the biggest growth in greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario. The government's actual official position is actually to expand the gas grid for space heating, and is actually in the process of adopting legislation to override an Ontario Energy Board decision around this, essentially to facilitate and to subsidize the expansion of the gas grid. The question arises, what should the federal government do in political terms and also policy terms around this? And the strategy that seems to be emerging here is, if we head into a federal election, is for Mr. Trudeau to run as Mr. Ford's friend, whether Mr. Ford likes it or not. Whether this is a good strategy, I think, is an open question. It does run a very significant risk of alienating the progressive and urban constituencies that were very central to Mr. Trudeau's success in Ontario in 2019 and 2021. And indeed, there's some very important sort of developments in Ontario around this, given that we've seen successful mobilizations of particularly labor and environmental communities in response to the actions of the Ford government. I mean, labor around Bill 28, which actually would have invoked the notwithstanding clause, and then Bill 124. And then the environmental movement kind of found refound a mojo I think it didn't know it had anymore, in pushing back on the decision to remove lands from the Greenbelt, in both cases, forcing the Ford government to back down. This would suggest perhaps a somewhat more firm approach in dealing with Ontario, that if Ottawa is contributing as much in Ontario, some quid pro quo would not seem inappropriate. I mean, if Ottawa is financing what could be described as Canada's biggest climate policy freeloader, there should be something in return, perhaps peace at least on the carbon pricing question, if not some form of some more active and meaningful engagement. It's not at all clear to me that's what we're going to see, and I certainly don't see, if we're going to have a change of government federally, that you're going to see the kind of subnational climate policy leadership from Ontario that we saw during the Harper period. And I think we'll wrap there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. Keith, whenever you're ready. Keith, I think you're on mute.
Good afternoon, or good morning, depending where you are. Keith Brownsy here out at Mount Royal in Calgary, sitting about a kilometer away from the Tsutsina Reserve, Treaty 7 land. And I'm proud to say that one of our goals at Mount Royal is to have Indigenous representation of approximately 7% of our students. I think that's not a bad thing to do. Now, I've taken a federal provincial look at environmental carbon relations from the Alberta perspective, or in other words, what's going on in Alberta.
Yes, I think you click on here.
There. Oh,
And then just go back, hit the back there. Yeah.
there we are. There, I think, sums up the relationship between the federal government and the government of Alberta here in 2024. If you don't know, our premier is Danielle Smith, and the fellow on the right of the screen is Justin Trudeau, just for clarification. And environment and energy are linked in Alberta. They're inseparable. And the energy sector in Alberta, that is mainly the oil and gas, natural gas sector, makes up approximately 40% of provincial GDP. The oil and gas sector contributes as much as 40% of provincial revenues and has over the last few years, especially during the pandemic, contributed as little as 5%. The oil and gas industry is, simply put, the key driver for the Alberta economy. Now, there are 5 areas of contention in the environment-energy nexus between the Government of Canada and the Government of Alberta. The first, pipelines. We've all heard about the Trans Mountain expansion, proposals for the for Energy East, the Northern Gateway, Keystone XL. The second is carbon pricing or carbon taxes. Third, Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act. And coal mining in the Eastern Rockies, we often forget about that, but it's a very important issue here. And of course, clean energy and renewables. I think most of us are aware that the province put a 7-month moratorium on all new renewable projects in the province and has recently, that is in February, issued new regulations which more or less end the renewable sector in this province. I don't see anything coming on. I'm unaware of any new projects coming online within the next year to 18 months. Now, we've seen this before from Environment and Climate Change Canada, and we noticed that Alberta in 2022 emitted approximately 270 megatons of carbon into the atmosphere. We're by far the #1 emitter in Canada. Now, with Alberta's vast oil and gas, natural gas resources, the province contributes a disproportionate share of Canada's carbon emissions. And the current United Conservative Party government opposes all interference with exploration, production, and distribution of oil and natural gas. As Danielle Smith, our premier, has stated, we have, the province has the right to exploit our resources. Smith stated in November 23 to the Canadian Association of Energy Contractors, we will fight for you, we will go to the wall for you. Now, the first of the federal provincial issues in the environment energy nexus is pipelines. There is a problem of transmission capacity in the oil and natural gas sector. A number of pipelines were considered by the Chrétien Liberals, the Conservative government of Stephen Harper. As I mentioned a few moments ago, Energy East, Northern Gateway, the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion, and the Keystone XL, to name only four of the most prominent. Of these proposed pipelines, only one was given a permit to go ahead with construction. That is the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion. But in late winter 2018, Kinder Morgan Canada stated that it was no longer willing to complete the TMX. This was due to cost overruns and the political and legal uncertainty surrounding environmental assessment and Indigenous consultation. But after several months of intense negotiation, the federal Liberal Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau, and the new Democratic Premier of Alberta, Rachel Notley, announced that the Government of Canada would nationalize the TMX project and complete construction. At the time of the nationalization, the TMX estimated cost was $5.4 billion. As of February 2024, the cost to complete TMX had exceeded $34 billion. Since the project was approved, the TMX has also strained relations with the government of British Columbia. In 2012, the Liberal government of BC threatened to oppose any pipeline construction in the province unless certain assurances were given on the environment and that the province would benefit financially from the project. In July 2017, the new Democratic government under John Horgan vowed to use every tool at its disposal to stop this pipeline. Several Indigenous groups along the pipeline route contested the project in the courts. These were protracted delays, which added to the cost of the project. But after years of controversy, years of expense, the pipeline is recently open and transmits almost 900,000 barrels of heavy oil a day to its terminus located in Burnaby, a Vancouver suburb, for those of you who don't know the area. It was the federal government's persistence in funding that led to the completion of the TMX. And did they get a reward? Were they rewarded in any way politically for spending $34 billion on the TMX? No, I think is the simple answer. They have not. In fact, there was an enormous resentment within the oil and gas community that the federal government nationalized the project and that the federal government had to take it over. There are many here who believe that the free market should have been left to work. The second area of conflict is the federal proposal to meet the emissions targets agreed to at Paris 2015. The Paris Accord was vehemently opposed by several of the oil and gas industry groups, but especially the Explorers and Producers Association. To understand this, this is the small oil and producer. These are people that produce approximately 5,000 or less barrels per day. They were adamant that they should not be restricted in any way in terms of carbon emissions. The Alberta New Democratic government's response to the accord was to launch a provincial carbon tax in January 2017. Their plan, the NDP plan, allowed the province to keep the revenue collected from the tax in Alberta. The 2017 provincial carbon tax applied to all carbon-based fuels in the province. It should be noted at this point that Alberta had introduced the specified gas emitters regulation, ESCR, in 2008. ESCR was the first carbon tax in Canada, but was limited in scope to large emitters. Well, the UCP comes into office in 2019 in April, and it ended the provincial carbon tax. In its very first piece of legislation, Bill 1, the new government repealed the provincial carbon tax, and the province lost approximately $1.2 billion in revenue. The UCP government then joined with other provinces in a court challenge against the Government of Canada's carbon pricing plans. On the 25th of March 2021, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the federal government's carbon pricing plan was constitutional, that it was within the jurisdiction of the federal government to impose a carbon pricing scheme. On the 1st of January 2020, the federal government then introduced its own carbon pricing scheme, its own carbon tax in Canada. The Liberal government said that they would spend the revenues from this carbon tax in the province, but that they would spend it on projects of their choosing. Well, in the fall of 2022, the recently chosen Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, claimed she had new evidence, that new evidence had been discovered and that the province would be back in court to challenge the federal levy on carbon emissions. There has been no new evidence made available to anyone in Alberta. The federal government's Environmental Assessment Act, the IAA, and its enabling legislation, Bill C-69, was another point of disagreement between the provincial and federal governments. Bill C-69 was called the No More Pipelines legislation by the United Conservative Party before it was the government. While much criticized by the UCP, many in the oil and gas sector believe that the IAA clarified the pipeline exploration and production processes. That is to say, the legislation mandated environmental assessments of new energy projects and Indigenous consultation. And this bill was, from the Alberta perspective, an attempt to avoid lengthy court challenges to provincial projects. There was now a clearly stated procedure through which infrastructure would be assessed. A fourth area, I should say, of federal provincial conflict, at least since the election of the UCP government, is the issue of coal mining in the Eastern Rockies. Coal mining, in 2019, an Australian company, Benga Mining, applied for a permit to operate an open pit. I'm sorry, the industry likes to call this surface harvesting, an open pit coal mine on Grassy Mountain in the Eastern Rockies near, Pincher Creek. A joint federal provincial environmental assessment recommended that the mine not be licensed. As well, the UCP Minister of Energy at the time, Sonia Savage, kept in place a 1976 coal policy which prohibited coal mining in the Eastern Rockies. Nevertheless, the UCP government allowed Benga's successor, Northback Mining, to reapply. The application was sent to the Alberta Energy Regulator by the Minister of Energy, Brian Jean, stating that the project fell into an exempt category. We're not sure what that means. In February 2024, the federal court allowed a judicial review of the project. Now, this is a federal issue as well as a provincial issue because water flows both east and west in the Eastern Rockies at this particular point, and it can become a very, very dramatic environmental impacts on wildlife, on the fisheries, and on communities in the area, Pincher Creek. So on the 19 August 2023, the government issued its climate energy regulations. These regulations were, of course, designed to achieve zero emissions in electricity generation by 2035. So what did the Alberta government do? The Alberta government responded to these new regulations by placing a 7-month moratorium on the development of renewable energy sources such as wind and solar. The provincial government said that they had been asked to do so by the Alberta Energy Systems Operator and the Alberta Energy Regulator. Emails made public this last month revealed that both of these agencies had supported the expansion of renewable energy or renewable electricity generation. Approximately 17% of Alberta's electricity is generated by wind and solar. The remaining generation comes from a combination of natural gas and coal. These energy renewable regulations were seen as an effort to boost the natural gas sector in the province. Now, the estimated cost of this 7-month renewable moratorium and the rule changes for new projects is put at $10 billion by the Pembina Institute. That's not 10 million, this is $10 billion.
Keith, just a few seconds left.
Thank you. I'll just finish with this, that federal-provincial conflict has been a constant in Alberta-Ottawa environmental energy relations since Confederation. The current conflict is multifaceted and includes pipelines, opposition to carbon pricing, Impact Assessment Act in the Rockies, and a hostile response to the Government of Canada's clean energy regulations. And of course, the conflict is about jurisdiction, which level of government is allowed to regulate oil and gas, carbon emissions, and anything else associated with natural resource development, but it is also about ideology. The current provincial government is firmly opposed to any measure which they believe would interfere or does interfere with the exploration, production, and sale of fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Keith. And now, George, over to you.
And now for something completely different. Greetings from the left coast. I'm seated in East Vancouver, which is the shared territory of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish people. I'm going to talk about the BC Climate Policy Framework and how it's evolved over the last decade or so. We can see some quite significant changes, the overall big picture being that British Columbia has been, for a period of time, a leader, and now I would say is quite cooperative and is showing increasing harmonization with the federal government framework. There is not that much good news with respect to actual trends on emissions. The latest emission trends report from the federal government shows BC's emissions have only declined by 2.5% since 2005. This only has the 2021 data from British Columbia, but it shows the trends, the kind of the flat line of historic emissions since 2005, but also shows the legislated targets that British Columbia has. It's a very kind of a peculiar situation. The legislation in BC only has the 2050 target being 80% below 2007 levels, but the government has a number of times in policy declared that they are consistent with the federal net zero by 2050 target. They just haven't legislated it yet. I should say that despite the lack of significant progress in emissions, BC's carbon intensity has declined considerably. Its population has increased greatly, so that its 2021 per capita emissions were 21% below 2007, but obviously not as steep a decline as Quebec's, as was shown earlier. A bit of context and pre-2018 history. The major context is that BC has enormous energy resources, both the clean hydro resource and a really massive natural gas resource, and that kind of sets up the kind of contradictions of BC's climate policy. Under Gordon Campbell, BC was an early leader in Canadian climate policy and even North American climate policy, with an introduction of a relatively aggressive 2020 target, which was never met. but also the prominent carbon tax introduced in 2008, which was economy-wide, revenue neutral, and contained measures to directly address regressivity. Began at $10 a ton in that year and was scheduled to increase by $5 a ton per year. When Christy Clark came into office in 2012, she thought that British Columbia was dancing alone on carbon pricing. That's a phrase she used, and so capped the carbon price at that period, where it remained until Clark was replaced by the NDP government of John Horgan, which was also supported by the Green Party, led at the time by Andrew Weaver. In addition to that carbon pricing framework, two other quite strong regulations in the BC framework exist: the Clean Electricity Standard of 93% clean and renewable electricity, which has been exceeded every year since then, and the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which gradually ratchets down the carbon intensity of fuels. Keith gave a overview of BC's aggressive opposition to new oil sands pipelines. I don't need to do that, just to clarify that the record of the province is 1-1. The Northern Gateway was rejected eventually, but Trans Mountain expansion has recently opened. And just a little local note for those people who aren't from British Columbia and haven't been deeply immersed in the Trans Mountain expansion project controversy. It's actually opened with remarkably little fanfare. There have been no protests or no sense of outrage. It seems like after putting up the one of the biggest battles one could possibly imagine, people have accepted that this is a cost of moving on. We also have some quite ambitious developments in LNG that are going on, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. The big shift in climate policy came in December 2018 with the introduction of BC's Clean BC policies. And I put that photo up there. I got to go to the event. That's, of course, Horgan there, but that's Andrew Weaver with him and Environment and Climate Action Minister, Climate Strategy Minister George Heyman, all of whom were extremely instrumental in crafting this agreement. It was quite remarkable how directly involved the leader of the Green Party was in this. Of course, as a climate scientist, has a lot of expertise in the area. But it was quite a significant shift. At the time, they legislated a ZEV standard of all new vehicles being zero emission by 2040. They strengthened the low carbon fuel standard. They dictated that every new building had to be net zero energy ready by 2032. And they put in a new industrial incentive program, which I'll talk about in a little more detail in a sec. Those policies were modeled to get them 3/4 of the way towards their 40% emission reduction target by 2030. And they committed to outlining those remaining reductions within 18 to 24 months. Of course, the pandemic hit and lots of things were delayed, but they did end up making good on their promise just a little bit late. In October 2021, they came up with the roadmap to 2030, where they agreed to meet or exceed the federal carbon price, and they moved the 100% ZEV requirement to 2035. I should note that it's a really interesting sign of how far our federal government has come that BC celebrated the declaration of those first two bullets there, when all they're doing is announcing they're complying with federal government policy. The new industry projects must have enforceable plans to reach BC's legislated and sectoral targets and net zero by 2050. So that's again where that net zero comes in. BC does have sector-specific targets, including for oil and gas. It also introduced stronger regulations that will nearly eliminate industrial methane emissions by 2035. They moved up and strengthened the building requirement that all new buildings must be zero carbon instead of zero carbon ready by 2030. And they increased the clean fuel and energy efficiency requirements. Remarkably, these policies were modeled to achieve the 40% emission reductions by 2030. So the province made good on its commitment to design policies that, if implemented properly, could actually meet their 40% reduction target. They backed off a little bit on that in a recent accountability report, noting that they are expecting that these policies will achieve 96% of that goal. EB was took over. David Eby took over as premier in 2022, and his first big energy policy announcement related to climate was the Energy Action Framework. It came on the heels of approving Cedar LNG, so the second LNG facility to be approved in BC, much smaller than the larger one, LNG Canada. But it was run by the Haisla, and there was a big celebration around that. But it also had electricity driving the liquefaction process, and so it was a much lower GHG footprint for the industrial facility. But what they did is they chose to extend that requirement to all proposed LNG facilities. So no new LNG facility can be built without having a net zero by 2030 plan. That again is just the facility, not the upstream or downstream emissions. They have a sector target for oil and gas, but they recommitted to actually legislating that. They have yet to do so on that. They established a Clean Energy and Major Projects Office to fast-track clean energy investments, and BC Hydro is increasing its efforts to expand the province's renewable electricity. There's been a big shift in the carbon tax and a kind of partial harmonization with respect to how big an industry is treated. British Columbia originally, from 2008 to 2018, applied the carbon tax to industrial facilities like it did all other emissions. But in 2019, it introduced, when it got that Clean BC program, introduced the Industrial Incentive Program, which gave rebates to firms that exceeded what the province called world-leading low-carbon emission benchmarks. And then just recently, last month, the government introduced its own BC output-based pricing system. That OBPS is designed like the other OBPSs around the country, where there are sector-specific emission intensity targets. If firms do not meet that target, they have to either purchase credits or pay a fee. If they exceed that target, they earn credits and get rebates. What is interesting about this development is I don't know if any of us have any idea how the provincial OBPSs compare to the federal backstop or to each other. And it seems to be a policy instrument in a way that's designed to be so inscrutable that it's very hard to exercise the kind of transparency required to have a sense of whether or not these provincial standards are comparable to each other or actually really meet the federal benchmark. There is, however, something to be released this summer where the Climate Change Institute and Navius are working together to produce a cross-province comparison of these things. So that should enlighten us a little bit on that. We have an election coming up in the fall, not the one that you're really worried about, but it's a very bizarre situation right now in British Columbia, where we have an NDP government that seems to be largely in command of things. We used to have a BC Liberal Party, which has no affiliation to the federal Liberal Party, but for a period of time was the dominant party in British Columbia. It completely lost its brand, and it's actually changed its name recently to the BC United Party. As a result of that, no one knows who they are. And all of a sudden, the Federal Conservative Party, that barely ran any candidates in the previous election, is second in polling. And so it's just this very bizarre situation. But unless that BC United Party and the Conservative Party can find a way to unite prior to October, which is right around the corner, it looks very, very likely that the NDP will have a substantial majority and be able to continue these relatively ambitious climate policies. Last slide here. BC was an early innovative leader, but it failed to meet its ambitious targets. It has witnessed renewed commitment after the NDP came to power in 2017. Now there is much more convergence with the federal backstop, but BC is still outside of the federal system. It still sets its own independent policies. There's minimal progress to targets thus far, but a plausible plan in place to meet 2030 targets. So that's the report from the West Coast, entirely different from both Ontario and Alberta in terms of the relative level of harmonization and cooperation with the federal government. Thanks.
Right, thank you so much, George. And we've got about around 20 minutes now left for questions and answers. So we can start the Q&A portion now. Just a quick reminder, if you could use the raise hand function, that would be great. And feel free to introduce yourself real quickly too. Okay, so while we're waiting for some of those, oh, there we go. We have a hand up.
Hi there. My name is Angela Bischoff. I am in Ontario with the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. And I wondered if, Mark, you addressed slightly the provincial government's commitment to, their climate objective supposedly is to reduce emissions by investing massive amounts, like over $100 billion in nuclear. And the federal government is likewise investing lots of money into this, potential SMR technology, small modular reactor technology. I wonder if you could address that in the context of climate change, Mark.
Sure. I mean, there's also discussions around SMRs in Alberta and Saskatchewan, I would note as well. This is the centerpiece of the Ontario government strategy, as you mentioned, $100 billion, of which the only significant external financier at the moment seems to be the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Keeping in mind that this is happening in parallel with this enormous growth in the role of gas-fired generation and this near vertical rise in greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector. So I think there are differing views on this. I think one might charitably say this is at best a gigantic gamble, given both the technological and economic performance and experience with nuclear refurbishments in Ontario, which is part of this, and then also attempts at new builds, because what's being discussed would be the first new build nuclear projects in Ontario in half a century. So it's an enormous technological and economic risk. Provinces only just recently reopened the door slightly on renewables after completely shutting everything down, like Alberta did more recently, and then same thing on energy efficiency. So I think what can make the argument, certainly out to the 2040s, this is a very, very high emission strategy because it relies so heavily on gas. And then beyond that, technologically very risky, particularly things like SMRs don't exist, and that the other new build technologies are not even identified. And I think there's been lots of commentary to the effect that the potential around efficiency, the potential around distributed resources, the potential for additional growth in renewables, and around strengthening the relationship with neighboring jurisdictions has all been ignored. So this is a high risk, high impact, high cost strategy, I think would be the best way to put it. But it's one that the federal government seems to be more than happy to facilitate.
Would any of the other panelists like to add anything to that? Okay, I think Chris Boucher is next.
Thank you. My question's for Dr. Braggsy. I was wondering if you could help.
I can't hear a thing, Chris.
If you could share what you think the long-term impacts of the renewable pause in Alberta will be.
Again, you've lost me.
Chris, would you like to quickly type it into the chat?
For sure. Am I not being heard right now?
It's coming in a little fuzzy. So perhaps we can go on to another question. We'll come back to you, Chris. Daniel, why don't you go ahead?
Apologies. So used to Teams that I couldn't find the unmute and video button. But in any case, okay. So Daniel Rosenblum, I'll be joining Carleton University in July as the research chair in sustainability transitions. And my questions for Keith, but also for the rest of the panel. So a couple of days ago, pretty sure you probably all saw this in the CBC News. There was an article about the new head of the Alberta Oil Sands, Pathways Alliance, and essentially kind of trying to prompt a discussion and maybe some clarity around Pierre Poilievre's position with respect to the OBPS. And I'm, when I was struck by that. The first thing was, well, let's stay away from that, please. And the second thing that I was thinking was, this is potentially, this could be promising if we did get some clarity on this, but I think that was likely more naive than helpful in the sense that we're moving into, the Conservatives have really hitched their cart to the axe the tax, and there's no hope for kind of any real certainty around the position of carbon pricing. So what I'm hoping to get from you is more some reflections in terms of what strategically do you see as being the value of those comments, and perhaps any kind of knowledge you could share with respect to clarity around the position on the OPPS among the industry.
Is that directed to me?
Yeah, Keith, and
Yeah.
but also the rest of the panel, if there's a desire to weigh in.
Okay, first of all, to clarify, the Pathways Alliance is a group of oil sands producers. About 95% of the oil sands producers belong to this group. And what they were asking was that Mr. Poilievre put forward his stand on various environmental issues, but especially the 2030, 2035 targets for greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And there's been no, as far as I know, response from Mr. Poilievre on this. But it indicates a larger division within the oil and gas sector between, say, Pathways, the larger producers on the one hand, and the Explorers and Producers Association on the other. The 5,000 barrels a day and under, and the 5,000 or 10,000 barrels a day and over. You've got Suncor, produces 800,000 barrels of oil a day. And they're very happy right now that they have the TMX online, and they're selling an awful lot of oil, and not at such a discounted price as they were even a year ago. So they're making a lot of money here. Part of what the Pathways Alliance wants is to push the provincial government and the National Conservative Party into clarifying what their policies will be. And as the Pathways Alliance made very clear, they don't want to be an outlier in the international energy system. They want to reduce their carbon emissions as well. And they have reduced the intensity, but they have not reduced the overall emissions simply because production keeps expanding. And that production expansion is very much encouraged by the current provincial government. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. If anybody else wants to weigh in, I'd be happy to hear their thoughts.
Sure. Thanks, Danny. My my guess briefly, I think the OPBS will survive the transition in some form. Precisely for the reasons that are being hinted at here, that more internationally engaged industry is conscious that there are starting to be questions about market access arising here, particularly with the Europeans moving towards carbon border adjustments. And anything you hear in the United States, if there ever anything of any kind of national climate strategy, it's going to involve some sort of border measures. And indeed, I think the reason it survived, that there's a equivalent system in Ontario, and I take George's comment very seriously, but yeah, there's very little meaningful analysis of what these provincial systems really look like. I have a suspicion that exists in Ontario because steel and auto told the premier that that's what he's going to be doing, and that they preferred the flexibility of something that was controlled at Queen's Park to something that was controlled in Ottawa.
Thanks for that.
Okay, so if no one else wants to weigh in, why don't we move to Chris Boucher's question, which is, what are the long-term policy impacts of the renewable pause in Alberta? And I believe that was meant to be for Keith, if Keith wants to start us off.
Thanks for the question, Chris. What are the long-term impacts? It's really to shut off any more renewable development, maybe geothermal, but certainly solar and wind. For example, no more wind turbines within 35 kilometers of the Rocky Mountains. That's 35 kilometers from the base of the Rockies. Okay. No solar farms on arable agricultural land. That's been made very clear. And so I think the long-term impact will simply be to diminish the potential for renewables in this province. On the other hand, the UCP government has made it very clear that they are behind the oil and gas industry, that they will, as I said in my presentation, go to the wall for the industry. Renewables doesn't matter to them. That's all I've got for you. I mean, I could tell anecdotal stories about ministers refusing to enter a room where posters on the wall contain the phrase climate change. Stories like this are endemic out here. So this is the kind of government that we're dealing with, that refuses to engage in any serious talk about GHG or carbon reduction emissions.
Thanks very much, Keith.
I'll see if there are any further questions. I mean, certainly in Ontario, what we saw in the end was that the industry kind of abandoned the province. And there was a loss of capacity, which may or may not be gently ramping up. And I don't know where the renewables people look from here. Maybe Maritimes, Quebec, BC at this stage. But it sends all the wrong messages if you're trying to attract capital to a sector. That kind of instability is potentially pretty fatal.
Well, Mark, again, Pembina estimates that Alberta has lost $10 billion in investments and thousands of jobs in the renewable sector. We have post-secondaries training workers on wind turbines, on solar farms, on geothermal, but the investment has simply dried up from what I can see and has moved to other jurisdictions. As you mentioned, BC, Nova Scotia, it's moved out of the province. And groups such as TransAlta were quite willing to invest literally billions of dollars in the renewable sector. They're not even thinking that anymore. at least in terms of Alberta.
Pierre-Olivier?
Yeah, I've got a question for Mark on Ontario. You know, when Doug Ford was elected, some people said that it was in reaction to the electricity prices increases that happened with, some people were arguing that the renewable were increasing electricity prices in Ontario, and how can the government hide the nuclear cost and the actual electricity cost and future cost of nuclear when everyone is supposedly caring about electricity prices, and electricity prices seems to be like a hot issue, but when it comes to nuclear nobody mentions the cost. So I'm just wondering, how can there be two standards when it comes to electricity prices? How can these two things be coexist?
Well, the way this is being hidden at the moment is that the government of Ontario is spending $7.3 billion a year out of general revenues to subsidize electricity costs. There's actually a line item on your bill that is that subsidy. And if you look at the breakdown of the sort of cost drivers, it's basically the capital costs in the electricity system. I mean, the primary driver of that is the nuclear refurbishments that happened on the Pickering and Bruce plants, and now on Darlington as well. So that's been the answer so far, is quite literally to take money that literally would have been going to schools and hospitals. I mean, that accounts for almost the province's entire annual deficit is using general revenues to subsidize electricity costs. How they would be able to continue to do that on the scale that would be required for the nuclear expansion that's being proposed, which my back of envelope estimate is about $100 billion plus. I do not know. Because that 100 billion is also the optimistic estimate in terms of what it might cost. But I think this is a very, very good question. And the problem in Ontario is, of course, the complete lack of any planning framework or regulatory oversight, where the question would be asked, well, does this make sense relative to efficiency, distributed resources, renewables, the relationship with Quebec, all of the above. So I think it's fundamentally financially unsustainable, but at the moment, no government seems to be prepared to go there. At some point, they will have to.
Thank you.
All right, well, we have just a few minutes, so I think it's time to turn to some closing thoughts. And I'd like to thank the speakers very much for this timely discussion. I would also like to thank the audience for your engagement today. And Mark, you mentioned that you might want to mention a few things on Climate Talk Canada and about the recording. So I'll turn it over to you.
I should see if anybody of our other speakers want any closing remarks too. I've noticed in the chat some comment about this is all very depressing. And I don't know if any of us see any glimmers of hope in this story. George might be closest to that, or Pierre-Olivier. Before we close, just so we don't end on quite such a downer, before I do the sort of the final thank yous.
I'll just reiterate that California and New York are having stronger ambitions, and I think they'll go ahead with stricter cap and trade systems. So I think in the US, there is some leadership. I think Quebec will have to follow, for internal political reasons. Quebec will have to follow California in its increased ambitions. Now, well, I don't think we'll actually meet these targets, but we'll be moving there. And I think, the Canadian politics will move in another direction soon, because it's too costly to continue to pollute. It's just too costly. We're spending billions of dollars into pollution. Just being greener is cheaper. And if we want to grow the Canadian economy, we have to be greener. That's the key message I think we have to spread around, that we are paying too much to pollute right now.
I just have a half a minute supplement to that, which is really just to encourage everyone to pay attention to electoral politics. The most extraordinary thing that's happened in Canadian politics over the last couple of decades has been the Trudeau government's willingness to assert federal authority over climate policy. It's actually quite extraordinary, and it's been very effective. And so we can make progress if we have political parties in power that are willing to take the decisions and want to stick to them. So if we lose, if climate champions lose the next federal election, it's a major challenge, and things will devolve back down to provincial actions, and we can see from the panel how dramatically they vary.
Keith, any final thought before I wrap here? It gives us some glimmers of hope.
I'm reminded of Kafka's, at least a phrase attributed to Franz Kafka. There is hope, though not for us. I see the industry in Alberta, the oil and gas sector, leading the emissions reduction charge, either through the oil sands or through more conventional production. I see the renewable sector, because of Alberta's hours of sunshine and wind, really, although investment has been stymied now, a few tweaks on the regulations, we could see billions of dollars of investment coming back into the province. But as it stands now, we have a government in complete denial, a government that, as several pundits out here make very clear, is committed to, and I don't want to raise too many alarms or sound too far out there, but committed to provincial independence. That's all I've got.
Well, Ontario's not leaving, we don't think, so far. And I think your point about industry is an interesting one, because the extent to which there's been any progress in Ontario, it has come because the automakers or steel have pushed the government in those directions. It's very sort of spotty, but there's a little bit of interest there. I think what happens towards the end of this summer, if we have a bad fire season across the country, could be very interesting, because of the degree to which that makes the impacts of climate very tangible. If I were Justin Trudeau, I'd think about going then, at a point where Mr. Poilievre would be most vulnerable on the lack of a policy framework around climate change, beyond a 3-syllable slogan. So we will see. And we also have to keep in mind, things have been embedded at the municipal level and the local level to an extraordinary degree, and we do still see leadership at that level as well. So that's my somewhat hopeful element to conclude on, that climate policy is deeply embedded in many ways. But with that, I think we're at time. So I'm going to thank everybody, especially Runa, as in my capacity as SEI chair and sort of sponsor. Thank Runa especially for her chairing, but Angela, Keith, Pierre-Olivier, and George for their contributions, JJ for his help as well. As we mentioned, we have recorded the session. And we'll have that posted up on the SEI website and the York University websites shortly. I should also mention that there is a conscious effort to sort of continue these kinds of conversations through an initiative called Climate Talk Canada, which Runa and Keith and I are part of, which is very much set up in the memory of Doug MacDonald, who worked very much in the field of climate change and federalism. And hopefully you will be hearing more from us on that front as well, to do our best to continue these conversations. And if nothing else, depending on your transitional theoretical framework, keep the niche or the policy stream alive in hope of better times and policy windows in the future. So with that, thank everybody, and I think we're a wrap. Thank you all. So I'm going to end the meeting, which will end the recording as well. Thank you.